When Astarion asks to drink your blood, watch his face. That flicker of confusion when you say yes without demanding anything, that's 200 years of conditioning cracking open. In fact, every Origin companion in Baldur's Gate 3 is answering the same heartbreaking question. What does freedom look like after someone else has owned your life? Religious indoctrination, cultural supremacy, sexual exploitation, conditional love, institutional coercion, and literal unambiguous slavery. Each of these supposedly liberated people goes through a recognition arc where they finally name the control binding them and choose their own path forward, whilst knowing that they'll carry those scars with them for the rest of their lives. The genius of Baldur's Gate 3 lies in these subtle differences in how it depicts each of these traumas depending on how it was installed. Because childhood indoctrination and someone weaponizing your need for validation require very different emotional balms. Depicting these types of trauma is risky, especially in a game where you're given unprecedented control over your character's actions. These are 6 deeply broken people who don't magically trust you, and the game never lets your mute protagonist fix centuries of abuse over the course of 60 hours. The choices you make are to either enable or challenge their coping strategies that they've built, and so you become the axis on which their relationship with freedom turns. Everything can fall apart if you push too hard or betray their fragile trust, and so the central thesis that's embedded into every camp conversation shows how recovery is a perpetual negotiation with control. But first I need to establish the core terms I'm using here, because control and freedom can have very broad definitions, especially when applied to all these characters. For control, I'm using it in the most concrete terms possible, as in the acts of external forces shaping who you're allowed to be, what you can want, and whether your body belongs to you, and so forth. And by freedom, I mean having enough power and support to make the choices about which constraints they'll accept and which ones they'll discard. Because at the end of their journey, all these companions don't have freedom in the absolute sense of the word, because they can never attain it. What they regain is agency, and the ability to recognize their damage and getting to choose what to do with it. Let's begin with indoctrination, which is a particularly insidious form of abuse because you're trapped by the love for the thing that's hurting you. As your abuser becomes synonymous with goodness and purpose, you serve them because it feels like the highest expression of who you are. For Shadowheart, this manifests as her Sharan cult, a system where pain literally serves as proof of your self-worth. The cult's mechanism of control, child abduction, is so complete that she can't even remember she's being controlled. After all, you can't rebel against something you can't remember. The disgusting brilliance of the memory erasure is how Shah frames it as a test by telling Shadowheart that her memories were removed to protect the mission and keep her pure. Which is a betrayal so foundational, she mistakes it for care. And so by robbing her of the language she needs to identify her abuse, the branding of her hand just becomes something she accepts to prove her devotion to the Lady of Loss. You and Dame Aelin have to shatter that mental framework, and when her memory returns, she begins to understand her victimhood, which leads her to a fundamental crisis of meaning, because without Shah, who is she? But her path's not as simple as rejecting the evil cult and embracing her freedom. In fact, Shadowheart doesn't become independent at all in the good ending. Instead, she replaces one authority structure with another, shifting her devotion to Selûne, who's still a goddess that demands faith and service, but the quality of that authority figure is far gentler, offering illumination and connection to others. The genius of this narrative decision is that it realizes why cults have an appeal, because freedom is terrifying, and they offer a framework to help you understand what your life means. So if Shadowheart was simply freed from Shah's influence, the overwhelming sense of chaos would petrify her, but by giving her a more wholesome figure to worship, she maintains the structure that she's known all her life and can channel it into something positive. The alternative path of her becoming a dark justiciar has her receive her memories back so she can choose whether to kill her parents, because this is Shah's ultimate test of loyalty, that even if her agency is restored, will she destroy her only connection to her old life as proof she belongs wholly to her goddess. What's devastating about this is that after she commits this unspeakable act, Shah blesses her once again by erasing those memories, and so all the suffering, doubt, and moral weight is wiped clean as she returns to her life of perfect obedience with the noose pulled ever tighter. Lae'zel's introduction works at a different scale, but it follows the same architecture, as she's born into a culture built on absolute obedience to Vlaakith. and so every moment of her life reinforces the same message of her queen's infallibility, and to question her leadership would be heresy. And Lae'zel would never even imagine questioning Blackith, because it would mean imagining that her entire identity and purpose as a prideful warrior was built on lies. The game introduces the crack to this mentality through the Zaith'isk device, as Lae'zel watches what should be a sacred ritual of cleansing become an execution. Though, as we all sadly know, even objective evidence isn't enough to convince someone they've been deceived. As Lae'zel concludes that someone is betraying Blackith's will and has tampered with the device, because her first instinct is to defend the system that's harming her by finding a scapegoat to blame. That is indoctrination in its purest form, where the victim's loyalty is so total that conspiracy becomes more plausible than deception. And so when the truth finally breaks through and Lae'zel learns that the true heir to the Githyanki still lives, her arc shifts to defining the premise of loyalty itself. And so if she sides with Orpheus, it's not as simple as her changing allegiances based on birthright. She's experiencing an ideological rupture where she chooses to follow a style of leadership where loyalty is owed to the people, not a throne. But notice what she doesn't even consider choosing: independence, isolation, and freedom from all forms of structure. Because she still needs to follow someone. After all, it's the only way she knows how to live. But now she's not completely autonomous and has value as an individual. The brilliance of framing Shadowheart and Lae'zel as enemies is that they're both under complete and total control, when neither of them could ever imagine bending their morals for the sake of others because they have no reference for what freedom feels like. And what makes their liberation genuinely subversive is that neither of them fully heals, as Shadowheart still carries the trauma of having her memories erased and will bear the mark on her hand for the rest of her life. And Lae'zel still harbors the xenophobia and cultural supremacy that was ingrained into her. They both recognized they were being controlled and were able to step away from it, but since they still harbor these psychological wounds, does that mean they're truly free? Absolutely, because actual freedom isn't the absence of damage, but the ability to choose how you carry it. But there's a more intimate form of abuse, one that doesn't need institutions or religions. It just needs to find the type of love you crave, be it physical or intellectual, and builds a prison from the very thing that liberates others. Astarion's trauma is rooted in total physical ownership. 2 centuries under Cazador means that his body is no longer his own sensory experience, and merely a meat puppet for someone else's pleasure. What makes this disgusting to behold is how Cazador wraps his vile abuse in language of mentorship and refinement, so that Astarion would learn to interpret his own suffering as personal growth. And that internalized psychology is arguably more destructive than the physical abuse itself, as he begins to accept that his pain is deserved, and that's the real prison. When you first meet Astarion, he has a seductive charisma about him that you initially write off as him being a foppy high society vampire, as is depicted in other media. As in those examples, the vampires see themselves as the higher, more refined life forms that are gracing the grisly humans with their charm. And when he tells you that he was forced to seduce people in order to kidnap them and bring them back to the manor, you feel sick to your stomach, as he's learned over the centuries that his affection is the only thing that keeps him alive, and it's his only framework for relating to living people. He's literally incapable of treating you as an equal because equality hasn't been a part of his life for a very long time. So is it any wonder that when he's presented with the option to never be beneath anyone ever again and become a vampire ascendant, he leaps at the chance? If you've spent the last 200 years as prey, then the promise of becoming the predator is irresistible. I disagree with the assumption that Astarion is evil and wants to become the ascendant due to a failure in his morality. It's a genuine temptation for an invulnerability shield and to never be hurt by anyone again. But if you can get him to recognize that perpetuating abuse will never break the cycle, then he chooses something much harder: to accept that he'll always be vulnerable and terrified, but he won't become the monster the world already sees him as. My favorite version of Astarion has to be the vigilante version shown in the epilogue, because it shows that he's inverted the mechanism of control. He's become the predator who still uses seduction and manipulation as his primary tools, but now he's weaponized his own damage into something that holds meaning for him, which is the most honest thing a survivor can achieve. Gale's situation is structurally similar but psychologically separate, because Gale has the language to recognize that he was groomed, which is an excellent choice on the part of Larian, because it would be exceedingly strange for a wizard to not recognize his romantic dynamic with the goddess of magic. However, due to her divine status, her words have held far more weight in his mind than any other entity could. As such, Mystra doesn't even need to be present for him to punish himself. He's built her into his self-worth so completely that her silence after the orb incident feels like a deserved punishment for his own failure, which is an exquisite cruelty, as merely withholding her approval is enough to morally devastate him. This is where the grooming becomes explicit. Any healthy mentor and student relationship would allow for mistakes. But to Mystra, perfection is the only acceptable state, so to Gale, any deviation from her divine will is a personal failure. What makes this abuse so devastatingly effective is that Mystra is the source of his power. She's woven so completely into his identity that to reject her means rejecting magic itself. And this is what Baldur's Gate 3 understands about grooming that most narratives miss. It's about targeting someone's dependency. Their relationship is akin to entrapment because the difference in their power is literally infinite, as Mystra made sure that the thing Gale loves most in the realms, magic, exists entirely at her discretion. So when she infects him with a magical bomb and offers suicide as the path to redemption, us as outside observers immediately see that as irredeemable abuse. But to Gale, it's merely evidence that he's not good enough. It's a particularly obscene cruelty because it's transformed his body into a symbol of her rejection, as his every heartbeat acts as another reminder that he failed her. What's truly despicable is that she knows her silence is more effective than any kind of act of condemnation, because she knows Gale has learned to wield her judgment as a weapon against himself, which is the ultimate victory for Mystra or any abuser, because she's colonized his inner world so savagely that he's policing himself on her behalf. So for Gale to heal, he has to decouple his worth from Mystra's approval. As such, you have to treat him with inherent value, not because of his brilliance or gameplay benefits, but just because he exists. This doesn't instantly reverse the mentality of his dependent relationship. In fact, he merely starts to ask if he's allowed to live for himself. And even when he can stand up for himself, he stays grateful for what Mystra gave him, yet refuses to let her kill him for wanting more than she was willing to give. And by refusing to complete the arc she wrote for him, he claims victory over his doubt. What Astarion and Gale's arcs reveal is that power isn't the answer to trauma rooted in vulnerability. The real answer is to be vulnerable around people who won't exploit you, showing that even though you suffered at the hands of another, you can't overcome that pain alone. But there's a colder form of abuse, one that doesn't pretend to care about you at all, it just owns you and calls that ownership fear, perpetrated by those who subscribe to the false belief that consent given under duress is binding, such as the pact Wyll signed with Mystra at 17, when he had the choice between signing or annihilation. The repulsive thing about Mystra is how she forever presents this to him afterwards as a choice, like there was some kind of alternative he could have taken. And while from a technical standpoint he could have, like us, Wyll's human, so from an emotional standpoint, he couldn't. This is how Devils in the Forgotten Realm work as an institution, offering false salvation in exchange for perpetual servitude, then frame the transaction as equitable. What made Wyll especially susceptible to this kind of manipulation is that he was merely 17 at the time he signed the pact, and his sense of morality was built entirely from storybook heroism. Mystra has turned every act of his heroism into an act of obedience, tightening her rope because she's woven it through the thing he values most about himself. She found a teenager who believes that heroes must make sacrifices to protect the innocent, and created a scenario where the only way he could do so was to sign away his autonomy. We can see the totality of this binding when he speaks about his order to kill Karlach. It's something tactical to him, something he's never even considered refusing, because he knows what disobedience means, and years of subjugation has dulled his conscience. So how many other Karlachs has the Blade of the Frontiers cut down in the name of his fiendish patron? But what matters here is understanding that this corruption is incremental. Each compromise makes the next one feel smaller. The moral line has been gradually moved, so by the time he realizes how far he's been walking in one direction, he can't see the original line anymore. That's how institutional abuse works, the death of morality by 1,000 cuts. And that's where the game's accuracy of psychological depictions once again shines. Because breaking the contract means Wyll has to confront everything he built his identity around, and reckon with the truth that the hero of the coast was always following someone else's script. Breaking free of that script means discarding the cognitive shield that protected him from the full weight of his complicity. and that knowledge is more painful than any transformation. The father-son dynamic adds another layer of mental anguish because Wyll thought his sacrifice would earn his father's approval, but his father's reaction of exile compounds the trauma because it suggests that the price he paid was meaningless. So in Act 3, when Mystra offers him the choice between his father and his freedom, she's gouging that wound. And while it's not easy, there is a way to have both, but it requires rejecting Mystra's premise entirely, and that's the only way to win against institutional abuse, to stop negotiating on their terms. Karlach is at the furthest extreme of contractual abuse, where she was bought and sold into literal slavery. Her heart is the actual property of hell, and she can't negotiate or bargain her way out of that reality, and now the only control this soldier has left is how she chooses to march towards her inevitable end. I emotionally hate, but narratively love, that the game refuses the rescue fantasy in its entirety. In a game where your choices have unfathomable depth, Karlach will die, become damned, or something far worse. Because Baldur's Gate 3 recognizes the ugly truth, that there are just some forms of abuse that can never be healed, and some cages just don't come with keys. But even then, the game's psychological precision nails the fact that Karlach's agency comes in the form of choosing what she'll do in that cage. Cooling her engine doesn't change her fate, but she still gets to steal some brief moments of human intimacy, fully aware that warmth will one day engulf her. And choosing to spend your last days on Earth giving the people around you the happiest possible memories to keep fighting is a deeply profound way to live as a mortal. I feel sick saying it, but I believe for Karlach, the happiest possible ending is for her to become a mind flayer, because she's turning her death into something meaningful, which is the only form of victory she has left, and the game is wise enough to know that asking her to accept gratitude for a life of suffering is nothing short of obscene. Karlach's arc shows the limits of individual agency within systems designed to consume you, because she approaches her end with the clarity to realize that what you carve on the walls of your cell is more important than trying to escape. All 6 of these companions excellently showcases the game's argument about what it looks like to survive control, but there is a 7th possibility that restructures the entire game, where you go from the person helping them heal their trauma to being another broken individual fumbling towards recovery alongside them. If you choose to play as the Dark Urge, then the game destabilizes your own moral authority in a way that makes interacting with these companions infinitely more complex, which is a narrative choice of immense sophistication because it forces you to grapple with your own motivations. Like when you convince Astarion to reject Ascension, are you projecting your own resistance to Baal's whims? And when you help Shadowheart break away from Shah, are you replicating the only template for freedom you know? Your intrusive thoughts make these quandaries disturbingly tangible as they erupt from you mid-conversation when you thought you were safe, which is the closest any game has ever come to depicting what OCD and trauma-related disorders are like in reality. Sudden unwanted impulses that feel alien to who you are, yet echo from your own mind, and the way the urge interacts with your companions creates an exquisite moral tension as they try to figure out if you're genuinely trying to help them or just another predator wearing a friendly face. And they all respond in different ways when you indulge your twisted pleasures, which showcases something crucial. Astarion recognizes your darkness and feels less alone around you, whereas Wyll sees it as confirmation that everyone is capable of fighting back their inner demons. And neither response is wrong, they're just different coping mechanisms encountering a trigger they weren't prepared for. I cannot disagree more with the popular sentiment that the Dark Urge is best saved for a second playthrough, as their arc is thematically essential in completing the game's argument about recovery being a communal experience. If you reject Baal, he drains your unholy blood and you die, and for a moment the game lets you believe that choosing to be good meant choosing to die. But then along comes Withers, who is critically not a companion, but an external force that exists outside the cycle of abuse and remakes you. He serves the same purpose that we do on a regular playthrough, as proof that you cannot overcome trauma alone, and even if you have someone who can pull you back from the edge of the abyss, you're still going to be broken and carry all the wounds you've suffered, because true healing is learning to live as a person shaped by violence, but not letting it have the final say. And when that person then reaches out to any of the other companions, they have the ability to say, I know what it's like when your body doesn't belong to you, and you deserve better. and that's more meaningful than any outside intervention could ever hope to be. When you observe all 7 of you as one, a unified argument emerges about the true nature of recovery, that it's not about achieving some kind of fictional state of mind known as healed, but engaging in a perpetual negotiation with the control that shaped you, and learning how to carry those scars while regaining some sense of normalcy. The best part about all these choices is how none of them are framed as the objectively right path. All 7 of these responses are seen as valid responses to liberating yourself from control and producing a happier future, which recasts your role as the player and what your choices mean in the narrative. You either enable or challenge their coping mechanism and shape what they become. It's the found family dynamic of the party that acts as the real container for this work, because just being witnessed and not judged for your damage is what creates the conditions where change becomes possible. And while this party has no framework to understand each other's unique trauma, they don't need to, they just need to stay together. When Shadowheart and Lae'zel argue about their faith yet fight alongside each other, they're both demonstrating that disagreeing with someone doesn't mean abandoning them, something neither of them could learn from their respective goddesses. Because that's what found family actually is, a precarious coalition of misfits choosing each other despite their incompatibilities. Baldur's Gate 3 refuses to present its survivors with redemption narratives. Instead, it shows them as people living with permanent alterations to their psyches, doing the hardest work imaginable, and not replicating the patterns that harmed them. Freedom within this game is having enough support and strength to decide what forms of control you'll accept and which you'll burn to the ground. None of these characters regain freedom in an absolute sense, but now they're capable of choice, and that's the closest they can get with the wounds they harbor. The road to recovery never ends, it just becomes less rocky, and this is important for reasons far beyond game design. Because if we keep producing stories where survivors reach some kind of mythical state of mind known as healed, then we're lying to the survivors of these devastating forms of abuse by setting an impossible standard and claiming there's some kind of finish line they need to reach before they can be normal again. Your scars will never heal, your emotional triggers will never fade, and the reflexes you built for survival will never dull. But what you can change is your relationship with them. And so Baldur's Gate 3 offers the most valuable lesson of all, the permission to stop expecting transcendence and allowing yourself to stay damaged and still be meaningful. These companions walk towards the future, and they look nothing like the traditional rescue narratives. They're far messier and more difficult, yet they're also more true. Thank you so much for watching. For more Baldur's Gate 3 essays, here's one going more in depth on Astarion's method for recovery.